We are joined by a man who has dedicated his life to the cause of freedom, to fighting injustice and building a democratic South Africa. We are delighted to have Justice Albie Sachs, former freedom fighter and Justice of the South African Constitutional Court, to give this year's lecture. Mesdames et Messieurs, je suis très heureux de vous souhaiter à tous et à toutes la bienvenue à notre 5e conférence annuelle sur le pluralisme. Ce soir, nous avons l'honneur de recevoir le juge Albie Sachs, un homme qui a consacré sa vie à combattre l'injustice. C'est donc avec grand plaisir que nous accueillons le juge Albie Sachs, fervent défenseur de la liberté et membre de la Cour constitutionnelle de l'Afrique du Sud, en tant que conférencier de l'année. As an anti-apartheid activist, lawyer, judge, author, and speaker, Justice Sachs has fought his entire life for the values of mutual respect, equity, and inclusion. A chief architect of South Africa's post-apartheid constitution, and one who helped negotiate South Africa's peaceful transition from apartheid to democracy, he's a leading authority on the reconciliation of divided societies. This evening, we are honored to have the opportunity to learn from him. The Global Center for Pluralism has invited Justice Sachs here this evening because his life's work exemplifies the Center's core values. The Center's aim is to promote pluralism, defined in brief as respect for diversity. Drawing inspiration from Canada's experience as a multi-ethnic, multicultural society, the Global Centre for Pluralism was established by His Highness the Aga Khan in full partnership with the Government of Canada. It is founded on the premise that when diversity is valued, the result is more inclusive and peaceful societies. Next year, in 2017, the Centre will open its new international headquarters in Ottawa at 330 Sussex Drive, the former War Museum, between the National Gallery of Canada and the Royal Canadian Mint. The building will be a destination for dialogue, brought to life with events and programs for a global audience. As an applied knowledge organization, our research and educational initiatives seek to advance understanding about the sources of inclusion and exclusion in Canada and around the world. One such initiative is the Annual Pluralism Lecture. Now in its 5th year, the lecture is an opportunity for all of us to learn from distinguished individuals like Justice Sachs. With their work to build more inclusive and fair societies, our lecturers are individuals who inspire and stimulate our thinking. Following the lecture, Doug Saunders, highly regarded international affairs columnist of the Globe and Mail, will open a conversation with Justice Sachs, followed by an opportunity for you all to ask questions. And we will be taking questions from our online audience who are watching this lecture via live stream and who we encourage to join the conversation. Finally, the Right Honourable Adrienne Clarkson, who is a member of the Centre's board, will offer closing remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, with great pleasure, I now invite His Highness the Aga Khan, Chairman of the Board of the Global Centre for Pluralism, to introduce our speaker.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Justice Albie Sachs, Madam Adrienne Clarkson, Your Excellencies, Ministers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. What a great pleasure it is for me to welcome you most warmly to the Aga Khan Museum and to this lecture. I am particularly pleased, excuse me, always happens to me. Pages stick together. and what you do about it in the middle of a speech. And I'm particularly pleased that I can extend this welcome on behalf of the Global Center for Pluralism and the members of the Board of Directors. This is the 5th time that the Center has sponsored this annual event. We call it the Pluralism Lecture. It is one of the highlights of the Center's activities each year. It is something we look forward to beforehand with great anticipation, and something we remember afterward with great appreciation. And this year it is our special honor to welcome as our pluralism lecturer, Justice Albie Sachs. Au nom du Conseil d'administration du Centre mondial du pluralisme, permettez-moi de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à la 5e conférence annuelle sur le pluralisme, que nous avons le plaisir d'organiser pour la 2e fois au Musée Aga Khan à Toronto. Ces conférences offrent une plateforme unique pour le dialogue international et soulignent le leadership de ceux et celles qui font une différence concrète en faveur du pluralisme et d'une citoyenneté basée sur le respect mutuel. Aujourd'hui, nous avons l'immense honneur de recevoir le juge Albie Sachs. Justice Sachs's career has been a truly inspiring one. He has been a heroic freedom fighter, an insightful legal scholar, a compelling author, and for 15 years, a member of South Africa's Constitutional Court. And as most of you undoubtedly know, he was the chief architect of South Africa's new post-apartheid constitution, one of the most admired constitutions in the world. The creation of that constitution is a story with continuing relevance as nations across the world look for better ways of governing themselves. And it is about that constitution and how it was created that Justice Sachs will speak to us tonight. Justice Sachs' commitment to the cause of justice and equality has been the central theme of his life. Even at the age of 17, he was a passionate anti-apartheid activist. As an engaged freedom fighter, he was arrested, held in solitary confinement without a trial, and forced into exile. And he was not deterred even when a bomb was planted in his car, resulting in the loss of his arm and the sight in one eye. As a senior member of the African National Congress, he helped to draft the organization's Code of Conduct, a key document in advancing the ideal of an inclusive South Africa. And then, of course, came his role in creating the post-apartheid constitution, and later, his long career on South Africa's Constitutional Court. All of us who try to understand the challenges of pluralism in our modern world also understand that viable constitutions are the sound foundations on which healthy pluralism must rest. They are the vehicle through which the nations can reconcile the quest for national identity with the protection and the bridging of differences. In the pursuit of an effective pluralism, we can learn a great deal from studying the South African Constitution and how it works and how it was created. Constitution making requires a strong sense of idealism, married to a practical sense of realism. It requires a willingness to listen as competing priorities are expressed, and a readiness to negotiate as differences are reconciled. As the challenges of governance grow in complex and changing societies, a widely respected constitution is essential to the preservation of peace and the pursuit of progress. Canada's own Charter of Rights and Freedoms, has played a central role in making Canada a leading example of a successful pluralist society. And I should also point out that Canada was a helpful contributor to the successful constitutional transition in South Africa. That Canadian contribution in South Africa was principally made through the work of the International Development Research Centre, IDRC as most Canadians know it, a resource created during the Prime Ministership of Pierre Trudeau, whose dedication to effective pluralism was so important in Canadian history, and is, not surprisingly, mirrored in the commitments of the present Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. The mission of the Global Centre for Pluralism is to convene global leaders and to learn from their experience how to bring about a more inclusive, pluralist society. On an evening like this, we see how well that mission can be achieved in practice. Ladies and gentlemen, we are grateful that all of you are here to share in that experience and to join me in welcoming most warmly the Centre's honored lecturer for 2016, Justice Albie Sachs. Thank you.
If you did a paternity test on the South African Constitution, whose DNA do you think will come up? Despite what the speakers have said, it would not be that of Albie Sachs. It would not be that of Nelson Mandela. It would not be that of F.W. de Klerk. It would be that of Oliver Tambo. And my mind goes back 1988. I still had two arms. We're meeting in a fairly small room the size of this platform in Lusaka. The Zambian security around in case there are commando raids from South Africa to take us out. And we're discussing for the first time at a conference of the ANC constitutional guidelines for a new South Africa. And I'm going up to the platform and my heart is going boom, 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 boom. The delegates are, some of them are in the underground resistance, some of them are military, waiting to find their way back to South Africa, others are diplomats, others are people giving political support, others are journalists. And I'm anxious. My job, I've been given the task by Oliver Tambo to explain through the delegates there to our organization, ultimately to the world, why South Africa needs a Bill of Rights. There was great suspicion amongst the majority of South Africans about a Bill of Rights. Some of them called it a Bill of Whites. The fear was we'll get democracy, we'll get the vote, but there'll be a Bill of Rights that will freeze the status quo and give all power to the judges, and we won't be able to move forward. And I'm being asked now to say why the country needs a Bill of Rights. And I had three motivations. The first one was easy. it makes you look good. We were being denounced as terrorists. What will happen? You see what's happened elsewhere in Africa. If the blacks take control, they will just grab everything, look after themselves. There's no future for the whites in that country. That was easily accepted by the delegates there, that we want to put on a good face, to be well respected throughout the world. And the ANC had actually, in 1987, the year before, adopted a Bill of Rights as being part of its policy, fundamental program, and the year before that, multi-party democracy, so that wasn't an issue. The second reason for having a Bill of Rights was more complex and in a way more fundamental. It wasn't just tactical. It was Oliver Tambo's answer to the concept that was being put up to us of power sharing, group rights. And I think it's important at this conference, on this discussion on pluralism, to see how the concept of pluralism can be abused, because they were using the language of pluralism. And they were saying we are a minority, and they were using the language of protecting minorities to, in effect, protect the fact that whites owned 87% of the land by law, 95% of productive capital. In South Africa, the minority was the majority, and the majority were the minority. So the kind of discourse that favors protecting minority rights was now being abused to maintain minority privilege. His answer was, we don't want power sharing between racial and ethnic groups in South Africa. We don't want power sharing between whites and blacks. We want a common society of citizens where rights are protected through a Bill of Rights, not because you are white or black or member of majority or minority, but because you're a human being. And that was his profound vision and approach. Not to institutionalize race, ethnicity in the structures of government the way as was being advanced. To recognize pluralism through political pluralism, not through giving forms of autonomy, group rights, institutionalized, constitutionalized around race, ethnicity, language, skin color, whatever it might be. So that was the strategic answer. And I saw the soldiers and the underground workers and the others all nodding their heads and all very happy that now the ANC is discussing constitutions. Not just strategy of overthrowing apartheid and winning friends, but the kind of country we're going to live in. But that wasn't why my heart was racing. My heart was racing because of the third reason. And I said we need a Bill of Rights against ourselves. And I was fearful. How would they react? It's easy for Albie Sachs, this lawyer, middle-class background, comfortable. We're at the cutting face of struggle. We feel the violence all the time, every day. Don't come to us with your lawyer's language and beautiful ideas. But instead of any kind of repudiation or rejection, I just saw looks of delight. People knew the countries we were living in Africa had fought often bravely and nobly for their freedom, but the rulers, the leaders had gone on to become authoritarian rulers. They knew that in practice. Would that happen with us? People had seen inside our own organization completely unacceptable forms of behavior and abuse. Will that happen to us when we're in power? There's always the assumption that we would be in authority. And there was a look of pleasure, of delight, that we were willing to acknowledge and face up to that. And when it came ultimately to constitution making, we were very, very aware. You make a constitution not just for your first government, not just for yourselves, not just for the better people in your organization, you're making a constitution for the future. Lo and behold, when after talks about talks about talks, and then talks about talks, finally we got to talks, real negotiations. Took us 2 years. The big clash, and it's not understood even in South Africa and certainly not internationally. The big clash, and just by the way, the kind of legend now is, how did South Africa get the constitution? The marvelous, wonderful Mandela comes out of prison, 27 years, no bitterness in his heart, and he meets the wise, pragmatic de Klerk. They do a deal, they send it to the lawyers to draft a constitution. That's how it came. It ain't necessarily so. It just wasn't like that at all. It took us 6 years. We had breakdowns, we had rolling mass action. Chris Hani was assassinated, we almost erupted. There was low-grade civil war. People were being thrown off trains. And the basic clash was a clash of two completely different visions of what kind of structures of government we would have and what process should be used to get there. With the South African government in those days, we used to speak about the enemy. Then the enemy became, as we made some progress, the regime. Then we made some more progress, it was the bloody government. And it ended up with the other side. When we were right towards the end, we'd say, well, what would the other side say? So now it's somewhere between the regime and bloody government time. There's the clash. And the two views were the South African regime saying we must draft the constitution now. The constitution we want will have forms of power sharing. Initially it was between the races, then they dropped it from being between the races overtly to make it between the three leading parties. It just so happened the three leading parties would be the ANC, the National Party under de Klerk, and the KwaZulu and Carter Freedom Party under Buthelezi. And they said we must have three presidents representing the three parties. They must rule by consensus. And we have a lower house elected by universal suffrage. And the upper house will be the house of minority parties. Because everyone knows Democrats protect the rights of minorities. We called it the House of Losers. And the upper house would enable the minority parties to have a veto over matters of deep special concern to themselves. It was a disguised form of power sharing on an ethnic basis that would effectively make the constitution, instead of the facilitator of transformation and change and opening up the doors and access to everybody, the constitution would have been the barrier to change. The constitution would have been the enemy. The people, the majority, would have hated the constitution because it's preventing us from moving forward while giving us the vote. We had to blow that, and I don't like military images ordinarily, but we had to blow that scheme out of the water. And in the end, they said we must draft it there and then, and we said no, only if the people of South Africa as a whole, through mandated representatives, through a constituent assembly, which can be our first parliament, drafts the document, will it have meaning for the people and will it have legitimacy. Our people have never been consulted or involved in deciding their fate, their future. And now the self-appointed group of negotiators is going to decide for them. And we said we want a two-stage process of constitution making. We can agree in advance to certain fundamental principles that have to be in the new constitution. We can agree that a two-thirds majority is required. We can agree to have proportional representation. In fact, we even mentioned that with no cut-off point, so that the smallest party would be represented. And we can agree to have a constitutional court set up which will decide whether the principles have been complied with or not. This is a South African invention, and it worked. But the regime did not accept it. There was a massacre. ANC said, until the massacre stopped, we can't carry on negotiating anymore. And eventually, after some months of very tough confidential negotiations, the regime accepted that basic mechanism for going forward, and South Africa got a constitution. Miracles, we are told it was a miracle. Miracles are not made of minutes and matters arising and agendas and one report after another report. We worked very hard, very intelligently, creating new modalities as we went along to finally get the consensus document that enabled us, through the two-stage process, we elected the Parliament. Parliament was now given 2 years to draft a constitution complying with the 34 principles agreed to in advance. And I always mention, of course, they worked till late in the evening on the last day of the second year, and luckily 1996 was a leap year, so they had one extra day. And it was sent to the Constitutional Court, and to the dismay of my former comrades in negotiations and in the struggle in the trenches, we declared the Constitution to be unconstitutional. Overwhelmingly, it complied, but in 9 respects, it didn't. And for those who've been following South African events recently, I checked up recently to see what the 9 factors were, and one of them involved the powers of the public protector. And the principle said the public protector and the Auditor General belongs to a group called Institutions to Protect Democracy in the Constitution, and their powers, their independence must be safeguarded. And the draft text said it's safeguarded by a 50% majority in Parliament needed to dismiss them. We said that's not sufficient safeguarding. So it went up to 2/3. And possibly, if it hadn't been 2/3, the public protector, whose report led to President Zuma apologizing, a crisis inside the ANC, huge popular support for the independent judiciary that made that pronouncement, maybe she wouldn't have been there wouldn't have been the report at all. So we rejected pluralism in the sense that it was being advanced, even with that language, through consociationism it was called, in terms of the different groups in our society created by our history, often in tense relationships, being represented as such and trying to find agreement in Parliament and at the executive level. But we accepted pluralism in the sense of the diversity of our nation. And through the Bill of Rights, through language rights, through devolution, directly and indirectly, we gave massive respect to pluralism. So at the same time, we're trying to unite South Africa, which was fragmented under apartheid. We want a united country, not a unitary country necessarily, but a united country. But a united country, and in our preamble it says, united in our diversity. South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. And that's the fundamental theme of our constitutional endeavor. Diversity doesn't destroy unity, but true unity depends upon acknowledging diversity. It's not a unity that's imposed, it's a unity that's felt, enjoyed, realized by the people who are affected by it. I'm going to give you 2 examples of how that principle operates in practice, examples that we felt in the Constitutional Court. The first, in many countries, and certainly it has been here, the very vexed issue of customary law and gender equality, the relationship between the two. I'm not sure, was the Lovelace case in Canada or in the United States? In Canada. And people felt you had to choose. Are you on the side of recognizing Aboriginal autonomy and decision-making, in which it was seen women came off very, very badly, or are you on the side of gender equality? You had to choose. We acknowledge tensions, but we try to resolve the tension not through suppressing one dynamic, one element, so for the one to win, the other loses, but to find a mechanism of actually reconciling in a principled way. And that came 3 times in 3 important cases before the Constitutional Court. The first was the Bear, B-H-E case, where a man died. The woman he'd been living with, they had 2 daughters in a small house. The man's cousin comes along and says, I'm going to sell the house to pay for his funeral. It was shocking that his daughters have to leave because he wasn't formally married. She had no formal rights under traditional law, customary law, or under the common law. The matter comes up to our court. The other courts have been saying that's tradition. The Constitution recognizes customary law, but under the Bill of Rights. But there's also a right to, in association with others, to language, to culture, religion. So putting the right to culture together with the recognition of customary law, the courts were saying, too bad, that's the custom. It came to us and we said that violates the Bill of Rights. The argument that the primogeniture, as we call it, that the eldest closest male relative inherits, is unfair, it's unjust, it violates the principles of equality. My one colleague said, let it be the eldest child. It could be a girl child, the daughters would have inherited. But most of us felt the issue was so tricky. We were not against customary law. There's so much in customary law that is positive and affirmative and brings about social solidarity. Something which, in fact, our whole society needs. Ubuntu. A deep philosophical principle in African culture, which I believe is the source of the things that people admire in Desmond Tutu and Oliver Tambo and Nelson Mandela. I am a person because you're a person. I can't separate my humanity from acknowledging your humanity. It's not only customary law that needs that, we all need it. In fact, I'd say the whole world needs it. In Canada, it was Charles Gontier who was speaking about what's happened to fraternité, that element that's excluded from that sense of human solidarity. It's very strong in African customary law, and it's something I think that needs to be retained. In any event, that was that first case. The next case dealt with the rights on divorce, and what was called the Natal Native Code for Zulus said that it's the husband who inherits, the husband has the marital power, the husband controls everything. If the wife wants a divorce, it's tough luck on her. She can get a divorce, but she doesn't take any property with her. We said that was unconstitutional, and we developed the concept of living customary law. Customary law is not something ahistorical, decontextualized, a set of rules for all time. Customary law belongs to the people. It evolves as the people's notions evolve. And African women are now earning. They're independent, they're strong, they're citizens, they're voting, they participate as equals, and it's absolutely inconceivable that customary law can't be seen as evolving in a living way. It's black women who are part of the African society who are now demanding equality in terms of customary law. The third case was that of Mrs. Shilubana, who'd been chosen by the Beloy community to be their horsey, their king, their chief. And the royal family wanted her. The community meeting wanted her. And even the incumbent at that time, he was very ill, said she must be the right person. But just before he died, he said, no, I made a mistake. It's my son. The state appointed her, recognized her. The son went to court, and the judges said, you can't be chosen as a chief or a king. You are born as a chief or a king. That was their position. And the Supreme Court of Appeal agreed. It came to us. The court was packed. Women came down in buses, and one busload sat in the court from 10 to 11:15. The other, they went out, sat from 11:30 to 1 o'clock, right through the day. It was very moving for me. It was very wonderful to see the people packing out the court. And in the end, our decision was customary law is living, it's evolving. Even if there was a situation before where women couldn't be the leaders, the heads of the African communities, customary law now, this was not a case of the state telling the community you must have a woman for purposes of equality. The community itself wanted it and had been a position of judges saying you can't have what you want because of this particular rule. But that theme of living customary law is very productive. It's very rich, and it enables you to respect the democratic aspects of customary law, the meaning for millions of people for whom it's much more real than a marriage certificate you might get before some state official. It goes back deep into their society, their culture, their custom, relationship between families. But at the same time, it's not static. It moves with the new values of our new society. The second case I'll mention become quite well known internationally. It's the Fourie case dealing with same-sex marriages. And I'm mentioning that because if any case dealt with the right to be different, explicitly, strongly, powerfully, it was that. The whole case turned on the right to be different, not to be tolerated. Toleration in that sense is, okay, you can have your relationships in private. This was the right to express your love, your commitment, your association on an equal basis with equal dignity in relation to same-sex couples. And the reason I mention it today was because of what I found necessary to say in the judgment which I wrote for the court on the relationship between the sacred and the secular. And making the statement, which I'd picked up from a colleague of mine who was deeply religious, I am, if you can be deeply secular, I'm deeply secular, saying don't call opponents of same-sex marriages bigots. That's their worldview, that's their belief. But don't allow them to force their beliefs on people who see life differently. That can't be the basis of the civil rights of the rest of the society. And I spoke about the coexistence between the sacred and the secular. And I think that's much more powerful than a cultural line. We are the enlightened, they are the benighted. And we're going to push the line of progress and enlightenment further forward. And the result was extraordinary degree of acceptance by faith communities in South Africa. They weren't being clobbered. They were just being told, within your communities, within your faith communities, you're not compelled to celebrate marriages that go against your beliefs. And even mentioning in judgment something relevant now to debates in the United States, if Parliament, in passing the necessary legislation, decides that marriage officers who have genuine reasons of conscience not to wish to perform those marriages, then they shouldn't be compelled to do so. And my reason for writing that was partly to avoid the center of the whole debate being the marriage officer and their rights of conscience, rather than the same-sex couple who want to express their love. It shifts the battle to a very unfortunate, unnecessary area. It wasn't only that. It was also the idea of being married by somebody who loathes the ceremony was a factor. But also, belief is belief. It's in your head. The state must take all reasonable measures. People can't make laws for themselves. They can't carve out exemptions simply because of their beliefs, if the law isn't targeting them in particular. But the state, I believe, and I wrote this, is under a duty to do everything it can to avoid subjecting people to a hard choice between their conscience on the one hand and the law on the other, a form of reasonable accommodation. And the legal culture we grew up in is not comfortable with reasonable accommodation, likes bright lines, classifications, but we need to have decriminalization, reasonable accommodation, a whole lot of softening factors that allows for the fluidity, mobility that belongs to ordinary life. Now, reasonable accommodation. Houston, I have a problem. I'm coming to the end of my presentation, and I want to end it by making a presentation. And let me tell you the problem I have, and the education I underwent in resolving that problem. I sent an email to my wife last night. Darling, you know, I'm a very staunch Republican. I don't like titles. When it came to the Constitutional Court being established, we decided we don't want to be called my lord and my lady. We're not even called honorable. It'll be difficult for me to use the appropriate form of address to the person to whom I want to hand the most precious product of South Africa. It's not gold, it's not diamonds, it's not even platinum. It's our Bill of Rights. And maybe Kalina can stand up and just show it to the people. Don't hand it over yet. We are so proud of this document. Thank you. And I found it so interesting to see myself, and this was from breakfast time till about an hour ago, thinking of how that problem that Houston couldn't solve, how I could solve it. And the first step was to say, well, come on, Albie, you know, it's protocol, it's good manners, do it. But I've spent most of my life fighting against protocol. I could do it. Then the next step was to say, well, I'm in his house, I'm in his home, the place named after him, and kind of be a gracious guest. But I felt actually, you can't give something just to be gracious. If you give something, you don't have to give it. If you're going to give it, it's got to come from the heart. And then the way discoveries are made, just suddenly, of course, I'm not giving this document to a titled individual. I'm giving the document to the head of an extraordinary community with a long, long history. And through that person, I'm linking up with the community and the deeds that are being done in the name of that community. And that's something very beautiful. It's very beautiful. I'm overcoming, in that sense, getting beyond the reticence of my egalitarianism, but not because I'm forced to or I'm being polite or gracious, because I think it's actually rather lovely that I'm, as it were, leaping out of my particular circumscribed worldview, which I will defend if I'm compelled and obliged to bend the knee and show respect. I'll fight against that. But I'm doing it voluntarily, and I'm doing it because I've just enjoyed this whole experience of being here and reading the book and listening to what the center is doing. And so what I'm going to do now is, if we can go down together. Please don't get up. Now, I want to say, I'm going to ask you to stop clapping, please, because I want you to say something that I'm going to say with joy. Your Highness, please accept South Africa's most precious gift to the world and to yourselves. Thank you, Your Highness.
Thank you. I'm most honored. Most honored by this gift. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
When I think of the idea of pluralism, I think as a Canadian, we tend to think of it as something that just happens. It's the life we lead. Maybe we forget about some of the struggles that have caused it to happen. But you're talking about a challenge that South Africa faced in extreme, and that a lot of other places face now, which is how to go from being a place where you're part not of a nation, not of a plurality, but of a subjugated and dehumanized group, majority in that case, somehow to being part of a country where you can be part of a plurality. Like like it says on the American money, e pluribus unum, from our plurality we are one. How do you make that happen? And when I think about that, I think about the line that has always rung out to me in that Bill of Rights that was just presented is something that was unique at the time to the South African Constitution, and in its language is still unique, which is the second right in the Bill of Rights, appearing after equality, but before the right to life, and which reads, "Everyone has inherent dignity and the right to have their dignity respected and protected." And I don't know, I've always thought that that's sort of the hinge on which that transition turns, is this right to dignity and so on. It's the point where you move from being a group, being a subjugated group, to having at least the possibility of existing in a shared society. And you've had to cite that second right quite a lot in the rulings over the 15 years and so on. Can you tell me how that works in practice in using a Bill of Rights to build a plural society?
Yes, well, you know, the miracle, as it's called. We were living it in exile already. And I was just so deeply moved by Oliver Tambo's whole approach. And it was so educative to me. I get the credit for being the person who persuaded the ANC to have a Bill of Rights. That's not true. I was very skeptical of a Bill of Rights. I belong to critical legal studies kind of groupings, don't give too much power to the judges. And Oliver Tambo persuaded me for the reasons that I gave. And it was part of his broader philosophy. And you felt he lived it. As I mentioned, I'm very secular. He was deeply Christian. He often thought of becoming a full-time Anglican minister. And his vision was the whites in South Africa are too narrow, inward, selfish, wrapped up, self-referential to ever imagine the country belonging to everybody. We African people, black people, who've suffered so much for being who we are, we will show it is possible for black and white to live together. We will show ourselves, we will show the world. And that wasn't from a position of weakness, it's a position of strength, huge moral strength. So when Mandela comes out of prison and he goes around speaking at meetings of the country with his former guard with him, that's not from weakness, it's from strength. And people are amazed. He's not angry, he's not trying to beat us up. But he's secure, he's serene in that. And it's that core, that sense of human dignity that was, we found it necessary to put it in the Constitution. Equality is fundamental, of course. Freedom is fundamental. But you can get tensions between freedom and equality quite often. And we found dignity is the bridge between the two. In practice, certainly in the same-sex marriages case, certainly in the case that I mentioned of the situation of African women, widows and so on, dignity, that provides the answer. And you only get true equality, not if it's formal equality, technical equality, even material equality of the soul, of recognition, and that's where human dignity comes in. And interestingly enough, one of our imports from Canada was precisely on the question of the foundation of equality, a solitary decision by Claire Leroux de Bay in the Supreme Court, where the other judges were trying to find complicated formulations supporting equality. She said human dignity is the foundation. If belonging to a certain group results in you being denied your dignity simply because you belong to that group, as a woman, as an immigrant, as a black person, then that's a violation of equality. We took that over. We actually cited her. So thank you, Canada. Thank you, Claire.
That's interesting. And through that, you've been able, I mean, if you look at South Africa now through a half full bottom of a glass, the legal equality, the equality de jure has held up robustly. As you know, the recent government crisis stopped short of being a complete societal shutdown because the protectors were protected by a strong majority protection in the Constitution. Not just equality of black and white South Africans, but the even more complex range of religious and tribal and racial and class and gender and sexual divisions among South Africans has been quite robustly protected. On the other hand, de facto equality has been harder to materialize. Development progress seems stalled. The economy is in trouble. Maintaining a unified government has been difficult. This is a tough time in South Africa. Do you find that there's a limit to how far bills of rights and laws can go toward creating equality on the ground?
A constitution doesn't create equality. A constitution gives you the freedom to move. It gives you a set of values, certain deep basic principles. And our Constitution speaks about achieving equality. It doesn't assume that there's equality and government mustn't do anything to disturb it. It assumes we're living in an unfair society. And we've declared that in our court when it came to property rights. We said you can't apply the old English or Roman Dutch law on property in a country where instead of possession being 9/10 of the law, dispossession was 9/10 of the law. And that has to be the context in which we understand evictions, for example, of poor people from land that's needed for development, whatever it might be. So it's become quite important, the interpretation. But really, these are questions of political will. And for the electorate to answer in their own particular ways. What gives me confidence about South Africa, our problems are enormous. We can't blame them all on apartheid. Overwhelmingly, it's still a relic of 300 years of oppression and dispossession, lack of education, access. Of course, those things have a big impact. But we're making our own mistakes, and sometimes they're worse than mistakes. The things are happening that are dishonorable and quite unacceptable. But what gives me confidence is a combination of two basic factors. One is we've got a strong constitution, not just on paper, but we've got institutions to protect it. So the court came out. There was jubilation throughout South Africa. We watched on television. We watched on the smartphones. People were excited. Well, I suppose there are other countries. A whole day, I don't know who was working on that day. But suddenly it's possible to hold the president to account for something everybody knows wasn't right. That was immensely important as a symbol and as a practical thing. And the public protector. But it's not just that. Elections are very meaningful. Local government elections, ANC knows they might lose Johannesburg, they might lose Pretoria, Port Elizabeth. So in that sense, the Constitution provides something of either to frighten ANC to improve or to get an alternative coalition in power. But that's the one thing. The Constitution really means a lot, and we've got institutions to protect it. The other is we have a very lively population. People speak out. They're not scared. They even fight in Parliament. I was saying, if your Prime Minister wants any tips on how to deal with the opposition, come to Cape Town. But what I'd like to add is if our president wants any tips about how to apologize, and look as though you really mean it, come to Ottawa.
There could be a back and forth dialogue, I think, yes.
But people speak their mind. They're not afraid. They speak out on phone-in programs, in the streets, demonstrations, and that's got a lot to do with the freedom we've won. We're not going back on that. And so we can bring about the changes that we need. Maybe the third important factor that's often underplayed, poverty is cushioned. The super rich are super richer, so the gap is bigger. But a third of the population get welfare grants. I think it's the only country in Africa. It's not the neoliberal dystopia that's projected. The World Bank, by the way, advised us in '94 to have rapid land reform. So they weren't against change. They said without that, the country will never come right. The 3.5 million homes have been given free to poor people living in shacks, which means a quarter of the population have moved from shacks. They're not
and that's partly because housing is a right enumerated in the bill.
But not only because it's a right, because there was a very intense move. It's intolerable that millions of people in the urban areas should be living in shacks. And if you take the Goud train, which goes underground from from the airport to the center of Johannesburg or up to Pretoria, you pass through huge areas and you don't see a shack in sight. And I'm sure they didn't have the rebuilding there just so that passengers on the train wouldn't see anything unsightly. There's a very big black middle class. You go to any shopping mall on weekends, and in fact, it's the black middle class driving the economy. There is change. There's water reaching 90% of the people, clean water, a huge thing for women. There's electricity. It's great for studying and all the rest. But that doesn't permit or justify corruption. On the contrary, it doesn't permit or justify wastage of funds on stuff where it's not required. and lack of accountability, and the crime also can't be explained away simply on that basis. So we've got heavy, heavy problems. And I would like to see the country we were fighting for achieving the society that we wanted, rather than playing down the significance of what we achieved. It wasn't just something wonderful that happened in the past and now it's all gone. The wonderful thing in the past has left more than its imprint, it's left institutions. And we still have memories. And there's a huge debate going on inside the ANC now. It's not just between the ANC and opposition. The most interesting debate. And we'll have to see how that's resolved, who comes out on top. But we know in the background that strong civil society, terrific press, you won't mind me saying that, will you? Very strong investigative journalists. We know about all these things. The world knows about all these things because the cameras are there, the journalists are there. In fact, it's almost an amazing thing to see a pro-government article in a newspaper. You wonder if you've forgotten the knot, if they left out the knot.
Yeah, and they'll get roundly condemned for it, too.
Yeah.
One last question before we turn to the audience. As you say, it was a close thing back when there was this pitched battle between proponents of power sharing, of one government for blacks and one government for whites, even territorial division potentially, and a shared society. And pluralism prevailed. But when you look at countries now that are facing those sort of struggles, I mean, you could say that there's sort of a hierarchy. The most difficult thing is the plural society built on some form of individual rights, with one government for all. And then you get up to layers of ethnic federalism, and power sharing, and then finally secession and ethnic statehood and so on. And it looks today like those lower level solutions are the ones that are more popular. When you look at people talking about an end game for Syria and Iraq or something like that, so many territories around the world, the pendulum's almost swinging away from ideas of pluralism toward ideas of separate but equal, if you will. Do you think that that's an argument that can be won today, or when things get so heated, is it
I
impossible?
wouldn't make that argument. If ever there was an area where one size doesn't fit all, it's how pluralism can be most effective in upholding human dignity and humanity and peace, bringing about peace. It's so history and context affected and driven. So maybe if you take Syria, for example, where these issues are being discussed now, part of the problem is there's a very powerful group, as I see it, around Damascus, where the leadership is authoritarian perhaps, but it's seen as our leadership. This is our country, and it's been dominating the rest. I don't know what the ideal answer would be to have something like South Africa, but maybe it's just not feasible now at all. So I wouldn't say autonomy is not the answer. If Scotland wants to secede from UK, it's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. It's just a thing, and if the people want it, I don't see it as being problematic. In our case, the background was Bantustan's division, apartheid. They used the language of pluralism. The pluralism as understood there was the total opposite of the pluralism I see up here, but that was the language of it. The proposals being made during our negotiations were not for physical autonomy, territorial autonomy, but ethnic autonomy or different groupings, then moving away from formal race groups to political parties. That was their way. And I remember the one guy came to me and said, "We've got away from race, it's political parties now," as though that resolved everything.
Yes.
So I don't think one should hold up the Canadian model, for example, as the model for the world. It's a model for the world. And it's a model for countries that have a similar history, composition, evolution to Canada, where, to my mind, there's no doubt about it, the waves of immigration have enormously strengthened the country, and a sense of being Canadian, and then the whole Quebec, rest of Canada thing was kind of resolved. I wouldn't say fully resolved, but it's not flaming. But you know, when it was there, you wouldn't have to touch wood. You would feel the flames even here.
Yeah.
And even that has, you know, been quite complicated. So it's Canada, but maybe if you take account of
I should ask, if it had gone the other way, if it had ended up being a power sharing structure of some sort, could you have worked in that? Would you have run the court under those circumstances?
It would have been very difficult for me. But you know, you take history where it leaves you, and you do your best within that. So our whole life has been that. But we always had this clear goal. It was in our Freedom Charter of 1955, this idea of a single South Africa, basic rights for everybody. We fought around that. I often say, and let me say it here, I mean, this should be included in often, there's only one good thing that apartheid produced, and there's usually silence and shock. Anti-apartheid.
Yes. I think we have time to take a couple questions from the audience. And do we have someone there with a microphone? Yes, we do. And our first question comes from Susan Basili, who's the director of the International Women's Rights Project. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. I just realized.
Thank you for all of your life work. It's Susan Basili, and I just wanted to thank you, Albie, for all of your life's work and your storytelling. And I'm glad you talked about the Bay decision and the image of the courtroom filled with rural women. And several times you've mentioned the courageous Thuli Madonsela, the public protector, sorry. But I want to take you back to one of your early statements about the paternity of the Constitution and provide many people here who may not know some of the stories of the maternity of the Constitution.
In fact, when I first used that, I said paternity or maternity. But the reason I dropped it was that you know who the mother is. The mother is the person who gives birth. And the mother, in that sense, was all of us who were involved, men and women. And paternity I'm using in the sense to highlight it was the basic concept of Oliver Tambo. But the point is well taken. And I just felt it's a bit clumsy to say paternity, maternity, but obviously I made the wrong decision.
What I meant is, I know that you have some wonderful stories about the incredible role of the vibrant South African women's movement in the Constitution, and maybe you could share a couple of those.
Sure. Our Constitution states South Africa is a united sovereign state guided by the following fundamental principles. And the first one is non-racism and non-sexism. I think it's the only constitution in the world that uses the term non-sexism. It's got a long history, which I'll tell on another occasion, but we had to fight very hard for that. And it was the women's movement and the women's section of the ANC wanted it in. They said, we've suffered from colonialism and racism, but in effect, are we going to hand over power from one gang of men to another gang of men? The definition of freedom is very interesting. And that was, the ANC had decided, now this was 1994, that 3 out of every 10 people on their PR lists had to be women. So it wasn't putting women in to make up the numbers, it was moving women up to make sure they were amongst those who were elected, having been chosen by the branches. So ANC had 30% in parliament. There were some women in other organizations. In effect, they had a blocking third in terms of the constitution. And amongst one of the results that came out of that was a definition of freedom that's also unique. It wasn't just freedom from arbitrary detention, detention without trial and so on. It included freedom from violence from public or private sources. And that was in our Constitution of 1996, coming from the input of the women. And there were other areas. At one stage, we had a clause in the Constitution where we suggested rights for women. And those of us men who proposed it thought we were very liberated. Rights for women included equality in public life, equality before, during, and after marriage, and affirmative action to deal with past discrimination and disadvantage. And we felt, aren't we liberated, aren't we wonderful? And the women in the organization said, well, what about sexism? The cultural things, the practices, the habits, and so on. Shouldn't that be somewhere in the Constitution? So then we put that in our draft. And then somebody else says, but what's this thing about rights for women? Aren't women voters? Aren't women... They should be right throughout. The whole Constitution should be crafted with a gender sensitivity. And that had its impact, very strong section on the rights of the child. Now, of course, it's not a purely women's issue, but it was the women who were pushing, not just to say that the court shall take account of the best interest of the child. Long list of rights of the child, the freedom rights that I've mentioned, and there are other areas in our Constitution where you can see the impact directly, if you like, the maternal, specific maternal input came about because of the very strong mobilization of women inside and outside Parliament. It was also a cross-party thing to quite a large extent. At one stage, in fact, when we were negotiating, the ANC insisted that there would be 2 representatives of each negotiating party, 1 male, 1 female. And some of the parties said, well, where will we get the woman? And the moment I loved the most was when Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi took her baby to the negotiating table because we didn't have a creche there at that stage. She was kind of embarrassed, but we were thrilled. Somehow it humanized our negotiations at that moment in a way that nothing else could have done. The little baby being suckled, she breastfed because she didn't want to lose out on the discussion, and there weren't alternative arrangements for her. So the presence of women in the constitution making and in the drafting of the Constitution was very strongly felt. One doesn't feel that strength today. It wobbles. It wobbles quite a lot for a whole variety of reasons. One reason, a sad reason, but it's found in many countries, is the very success of the women's movement in getting women in high political positions, judicial positions. It creamed off a large section of the most brilliant, the most effective women's leaders in our general struggle. And then people get tired and they get caught up in bureaucracy of governing, and then others become defensive and they're worried about losing their jobs, and some of the oomph was just lost.
Do we have time for one more question? A small one. Does somebody have a particularly pithy and well-articulated question? We should auction it off or something.
With a short answer.
Not one that begins with, this is more of a statement.
Thank you very much. My name is Tom Saras. I'm the president of the National Ethnic Press and Media Council of Canada. I visited your country, Your Honor, during the apartheid and after that. My question today is, besides the political process that you managed to bring to the country, what about the social justice? There are terrible things down there as far as I know. I don't know if the government took any action to help the little people. Thank you.
Well, that's what we're having huge debates about. What's good in South Africa is everybody accepts from all parties that the situation is unfair, it's unjust, that the disparities of wealth are intolerable. There's nobody who says it's better in the long run to have it. Nobody argues from that point of view. But so much depends upon, I believe, on integrity in all parties. And integrity is especially necessary in the ruling party because they have so much power. And people get dismayed if they see top leaders behaving in a purely defensive way, not acknowledging failures and ducking and diving, and only when they're compelled to do so. And that's intolerable in any country. And it's particularly sad in our country where there's been such a marvelous struggle over the years. What many people are pointing out is during the marvelous struggle there were very bad episodes. Yeah. And I think it's healthy that that's happening. I used to get so upset when people would speak how glorious People's Army and Mkontiwesi's were, a glorious this, the triumphalist kind of presentation. It's unreal, it wasn't like that. We had struggles inside the struggle, very serious ones. Lots of bad things happened. We had torture, which we prohibited, but it came out into the open. We had opportunists, we had people who took money, we had men who assaulted women who were under their command and so on. We had all those things. But what was so positive then was the leadership of people like Oliver Tambo and Chris Hani and Joe Slovo and the others. They emerged clearly as the leadership. They gave the direction. That's why it's so important at the top, the symbol, the people. They don't even have to be brilliant. They don't even have to be superb organizers and so on, but they have to be honest. They have to be honest. They've got to listen. And I think that's what millions of South Africans are aching for, and certainly this South African sitting in this chair at this moment is aching for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me invite onto stage to give the closing remarks somebody who's I would say has served as Canada's de facto ambassador for the specific notion of Canadian pluralism during her years as Governor General and in her larger life, Adrienne Clarkson.
C'est pour moi un plaisir énorme de remercier Albie Sachs pour ce discours tellement humain, tellement intéressant, tellement personnel. C'est quelque chose d'inouï parce qu'au fond, on voit quelqu'un qui a vécu la lutte et qui a réussi contre tout, envers et contre tout, une vie qui menait à l'espérance, à l'espoir pour tout le monde, and somebody who now represents for us something, I suppose, remarkable in the sense of seeing a whole historical epoch that you have lived and that you have summed up. I have to say that for people of my generation who were at university as I was, going into university in the late 50s, the Sharpeville massacre was the galvanizing force for our 17 and 18-year-old souls. The Sharpeville massacre, the writings of Trevor Huddleston, Not for Your Comfort, the marvelous Anglican priest who wasn't appreciated by his institution totally, and who was pulled from South Africa. The fact that we didn't buy Outspan oranges, smoke Rothman cigarettes, buy South African sherry even though it was so cheap and we were students. And even to this day, I have to say, I find it difficult to buy South African wine. It's just a thing with me. Those things mark you forever. And then as a journalist, I went to South Africa in 1975 to do a documentary under apartheid time. I was given the classification of white so I could stay at the same hotel as my crew, but our cameraman, who's a superb cameraman, was of Indian origin and he wasn't classified that way, so he had to stay in another hotel. We had a time which was extremely difficult, but we managed to do a documentary and we put it on the air. It was 1 hour long. At that point, the High Commissioner from South Africa wrote to the president of the CBC and said this woman should be fired, and the documentary is biased, untrue, wicked, all the things you can imagine. And the president of the CBC wrote back a very simple letter, which is in my archives now in the National Archives of Canada, which said, "Dear High Commissioner, thank you for your note. The program was done by the CBC by a respected journalist, Adrian Clarkson. The CBC is an independent agency reporting to the Parliament of Canada. Yours sincerely, Al Johnson." Al Johnson later went to South Africa and was involved with some of the work after apartheid ended. But I was struck this evening by your use of words like integrity, dignity, the words of generosity, the words always of openness, the words of understanding of the other, the words that somebody truly versed in Ubuntu understands. I exist because you exist. And that great gift of that African philosophy is something which we everywhere must interiorize in order to understand what it is to be human and to function as a human being among other humans. His Highness the Aga Khan has frequently reminded us that we are creations of a single creator, and therefore we do attach ourselves to each other, even if we don't realize it, because we are part of that single project. To be reminded of that is always something which is to be first and foremost in our minds as we go forward and think about what we can do for our world, how we can take the example of your life, so magnificent as it has been, with its tribulations, with its trials, with its resounding successes, and with the feeling in the end, which we are all left with after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that the country of South Africa had been able to come to terms in the most human of ways with the kind of generosity and the kind of understanding and perception which is so rare for human society. When you had the dreadful thing happen to you and you lost your arm and you were blinded, I know some of your colleagues said, "We are going to avenge you." And you said, how? By cutting off somebody's arm or blinding them? And then you said, "Roses and lilies will grow from my arm. That will be my soft vengeance." Thank you very much for sharing your soft vengeance with us. Wonderful, wonderful. On behalf of us. Want me to open it? I'm going to open it for him. It's our equivalent of a matryoshka. Aha. Oh, yeah. Aren't you glad I offered?
Absolutely.
I'm quite excited now.
It's going to be this big.
It's an Inukshuk. It shows where to go, but he's always known where to go.
Now, this is beautiful. I thought it was a mug. Now, would you mind wrapping it all up again?
You can sit down. Put it in here.
Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a remarkable evening. We are so appreciative that you could be here with us. And again, thank you very much, Albie Sachs, for a remarkable and an evening full of insights. I would just like to ask you to remain in your seats so that His Highness and Justice Sachs can take their leave. And thank you again, and we hope to see you again.